Well, we may as well get started. Greetings and welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'm Gigi Barnhill, Board Chair of the Historical Society, and this is the first of the fall series of History Bites. And in 2 weeks, our speaker will be coming back with part 2 of Walking Downtown Amherst. Downtown Amherst has an assortment of buildings from different time periods. The oldest would be the Strong House, our headquarters at 67 Amity Street, which was built about actually 1754 if we had a scientific study of our timbers, and that's what it was revealed. The Town Hall was built in 1888. St. Bridget's Church was built in 1923. And the Amherst Savings Bank building, which is now Bank America, was built in 1968. A building we all love to hate. Here to talk about the architectural history of downtown Amherst is Stephen Schreiber, who has led popular walking tours of the downtown. Mr. Schreiber is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, which is a high honor. He's an architect and chair of the Department of Architecture at the university, and is a former member and chair of the Planning Board, a former member of the Town Council, and a member and former chair of the University of Massachusetts Campus Planning Committee. So it's with great pleasure I welcome him here today, and thank you so much for doing this.
It's a great honor to be here. So I've been to History Bites online and when at the Strong House, and actually I'm honored to be part of it because you really have a great series. And I should also note that there are some people I've known for the whole time that I've lived in Amherst, which isn't all that long, only 19 years. And some of you know much more about the history of Amherst architecture than I do. So I hope you'll speak up. But I want to give out also a shout out to George Naughton, who's the one that gave the invitation George's family and my family go back to the 50s, so we both are from the same town in Connecticut. And I believe that my father was your dentist, but my mother would come up often to visit your mother here, in which she lived in Amherst. So she would say that she'd come up to visit us, but really she was coming up to visit Mrs. Naughton. So it's great to make that connection. So this is me in a nutshell. So my main job is I'm the chair of the architecture department I'm definitely not worthy.
Just for a minute.
I'm chair of the architecture department at UMass. I was on the first town council, at really a 3-year term that had overlapped into 2 different terms. And then I was a member of the Amherst Planning Board. So I'm not an historian, so what I'm going to talk to you about is a way to look at Amherst through the lens of an architect. So I'm going to start off talking about some concepts and how those concepts might apply to Amherst. So this is what I promised. And actually, I think the very first sentence is notable, that few private buildings taller than 3 stories were built in the Amherst CBD between 1885 and 2010. So basically in the 1900s, not much happened in terms of the built environment in downtown. A lot has happened since 2010, and that's very jarring for a place that is used to there being no building, no private building. And I used to say few buildings taller than 3 stories, and then someone said, well, right around us, the 2 housing complexes right behind us, which are publicly funded, so I put in the word private. Anyway, so we're going to address some of those new buildings, some which you can actually see from here, and the reasons for those, but let's get to the fun. So concept number 1 that I want to talk about. So this is not scientific. This is basically Steve's way of looking at the world. Monumental buildings versus fabric buildings. So this is a concept that I think is really important to understand. Places that, like the built cities, communities that you remember and love, that they often have a combination of monumental buildings and fabric buildings. There will be a diagram. Sometimes you'll hear this called monuments versus background buildings. It's sometimes generals versus soldiers. So this is a diagram by famous architect Leon Creer that's trying to explain this concept, that memorable communities are made up of both monuments, those which the community has agreed that should be a special place, they should be in a special location, they should be a special shape, they should be stand out. Oftentimes they're religious buildings or city halls or libraries, sometimes banks, things like that. And then the fabric buildings, those are monumental buildings, are basically everything else. You're generally your mixed-use commercial and housing build projects. Basically the run-of-the-mill, the everyday buildings that make up a community. But most importantly, that the most memorable cities, and I would include Amherst as part of that, towns, cities, have a little bit of both. And not only do they have a little bit of both, but they have they're very strategic about where each one goes. So just the generals and the soldiers, I don't particularly like that because it relates to warfare, but nonetheless you get the idea here. So these are your background buildings here. So there's some consistency to those. The soldiers stay in formation. They're not all the same height, they're not all the same shape, but there's some consistency to it. And then the general or the leader is higher, more significant, easier to find.
But there's space too,
Yeah.
another category.
There you go. And my wife's a landscape architect, and as I was walking out, she said, "You're going to talk about space, right?" So this is Muscle Beach in California. So the reason I show this is because sometimes you go to particular places and it looks like every building's trying to be a monument. And honestly, my employer, UMass, Amherst, in the 70s had a lot of Muscle Beach buildings, like this building wanted to be that, this building wanted to be that. I think it's filled in a lot, and actually UMass, which is the topic of my next talk here 2 weeks from now, has done a really good job making sure that some buildings are monumental and then other ones are fabric and creating space, for that. So this is Amherst, just joking. This is, yeah. There you go. But this is Siena, so we can always look to overseas, Europe mostly, to find communities that have this mix of fabric versus monumental buildings. The various religious or civic buildings that really stand out, but then everything else is fabric. And in particular, a lot of the background buildings are shaping space, so either big public plazas like this or streets like that. So closer to home, another community that we often go visit because we like the vibe is Northampton. So Northampton, which grew up in a different way than Amherst did, it grew up really as an industrial community versus Amherst, which really grew up as first an agricultural and then an educational community. Built a lot of its built environment in the downtown area happened at a time when our transportation was mostly walking or horses, and people wanted to live near where they worked, et cetera, et cetera. So it has a really strong fabric on the main street of the 3-4-story buildings that are somewhat anonymous, and then some very special buildings, the courthouse, the churches, which purposely are monumental. And this is downtown Amherst, a drone shot before the North Common was renovated. And I think the downtown area has some really good examples of this. So the town hall, the church, Grace Church, are examples of purposely monumental buildings. The mixed-use buildings along here, along there, are purposely fabric buildings. And what they're doing is they're all shaping the town common or built right up around the town common. So then as we move to the old fraternities at Amherst College to Converse Hall, that fabric becomes a looser weave, but there's still a fabric there. So in other words, the consistency with all of these old fraternities of style, of shape, of position, it is creating a fabric of sorts. And that is the intent of the new construction that is happening on the north side of town. And we're going to come back to these. So So this is one most recently completed. This is One East Pleasant, 11 East, North Pleasant, or whatever. And so what they're intending to do in what the zoning code is encouraging is to create basically a fabric, but also to help shape space, help shape the space of the street, and in this case, these cases of Hendrick Park. That was just concept number one. Concept number two has 5 parts to it, and I'm borrowing heavily from a guy named Kevin Lynch, whose book I'll show you in a second. So they're actually related. So he says that the most memorable cities, this is a book from the 1950s, most memorable cities have these distinct characteristics to it: path, edge, district, landmark, node. And his methodology, this is his book. The methodology was, put bluntly, he would have a team of researchers go into various cities, Boston, of course, because he was an MIT professor, and ask for directions. And this is in the good old days when people asked each other for directions. And the researchers would listen to how directions were given. Go up to the Dunkin' Donuts, bang a left, no. But and what were the consistencies? Like, were they often mentioning, literally, the Dunkin' Donuts, were they mentioning, go up to the common, take a right, whatever. And then he mapped all of the ways that directions were given, and tried to come up with a language that was being used. So put bluntly, we'll come back to this. So a path is a very distinct way that you travel. So you might travel by foot, you might travel by car, you might travel by tram, but it has a very distinct look to it. It's obviously intended to be a place of transportation rather than a place of repose. An edge is something that, it's self-defined. It's like what we were just describing with the monumental buildings. It's meant to, to create a place. A district is an area of a city that has some consistent characteristics to it. Like we talked about the central business district, that would be one. Amherst has a couple of historic districts. Those are such because there are similar characteristics when the places were built, the styles, etc. A landmark is something like Town Hall would be a good example of a landmark in Amherst, or you might say, it might be the spire of Grace Episcopal Church, something like that. And then a node is bigger than a landmark, smaller than a district. A node is say the North Common might be an example of a smaller piece. So nobody can ever give an architecture lecture. This is a required slide. So this is the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And they missed it by a year. So it was a centennial, or the something centennial of Columbus coming to the New World. They couldn't get their act together, so they missed it by a year. So it happened in 1893. And the reason that this is so important is that it was designed really looking back through history to Renaissance cities, to European cities, at exactly the time that all of this new technology was being developed in Chicago, in the same city. Skeletal, iron buildings, then steel buildings. And it influenced something called the City Beautiful movement, but in particular it also influenced really revival architecture, looking backwards for architectural inspiration. At exactly the same time, people like Louis Sullivan, whose student mentee was Frank Lloyd Wright, were trying to develop a new architecture. So we're going to talk a lot about revival styles when we talk about Amherst. So remember this slide. But also it's very notable for its beautiful creation of beautiful spaces. A lot of this is still intact. It's where the Museum of Science and Industry is. It's also where the new Obama Library is being constructed. Aspect ratio. I don't see anyone taking notes, by the way. aspect ratio, so when I was on planning board, there was a lot of discussion about the look and feel of streets, of the public space. And basically the theory is that you can create memorable, the ability to create a memorable path, a memorable district, a memorable space is directly related to what you're trying to enclose. And there's no science here, but it's something to remember. Like a 5-story building on a park has a much different feel than a 5-story building on an alleyway. And so these are 2 buildings side by side. You know, this is an alleyway, 1-to-1 ratio. And whoever did the slide is trying to make this scientific. It's not scientific, but there are zoning codes, building codes that actually do make this scientific. You know, they should say that you shall be no more than 50% the width of the right-of-way. You shall be no further than 50%. Anyway, keep that in mind also. So I go back to our image of downtown. Still no renovation of the North Common. And also no construction of the new buildings right here. So, but like this would be a good place to sense that aspect ratio. And this is probably close to 1-to-1, right where the subway is and, you know, that building. So that's, you know, kind of a typical number, but it's something to pay attention to. Concept number 4, front buildings, back buildings. So this is from a book, I think it's called Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. Yeah, okay, thank you. So we see these all over New England. Like if you go on Southeast Street, there's some beautiful examples of exactly this phenomenon. So the farmer has a big house and a barn, and then builds a little house as the family expands, and then a connecting house. And all of a sudden that becomes a very, sort of beautiful way to live. There's an indoor path from the house to the barn, and that's one of the important characteristics. So I think that downtown Amherst has a lot of examples of the big house, little house, back house, barn on steroids. So sometimes it works backwards, where the barn started first and then we built in front of it. So my intent is to show you some examples of that. So this is not actually Amherst, but it's another way of looking at this idea. So this, obviously the front is not habitable, but in a way you can think of like the Western storefront as being an example where there's a front, which is meant to have a civic side to it, and then there's a back, which is meant to have a different purpose. Yeah, so I like to throw in aerial views of Amherst just to, this is right off of Google Earth. And actually the reason I showed this was I thought I was going to talk about little house, big house, little house, back house, barn, but I'm going to keep moving. Here we go. So I think that the building right behind us actually is a sort of a good example of that idea on steroids. So the thing about the Amherst, the way that downtown Amherst is, property has been divided and subdivided. We don't have alleys. We really don't have blocks. So what we do is we have these sort of informal parcels that are sometimes very long, and so and street frontage is everything, right? So oftentimes you can't build if you don't have street frontage or at least public way access. So, and that's why sometimes you see this string of buildings like a necklace that string from the front to the back, or from the back to the front, depending on what the history of that site is. So I think Boltwood Place, which was the first, my slide about no buildings have been built taller than 3 stories. Boltwood Place was the first, 2010, right behind us. It took advantage of a change in the building code, which actually allowed wood frame buildings over a hardened structure. So you could go, at the time it was 4 stories, so you could do 5-story buildings, much more efficiently than before that change in the building code. But also there was an incentive in the Amherst zoning code to basically encourage densification. So this is the first one. It was developed, I think you all, if you're from Amherst, you know this, former owner of Judy's, former owner of former Judy's, former co-owner of former Judy's, an architect and a developer, in a partnership with another architect-ish. They basically built this in the service lot behind Judy's, but also on the new parking lot, the parking lot that is right here. So it's a mixed-use building, 5 stories, and it was the first of a wave of such buildings to be built. This is another one that is right over here. We should just open the slides. So this is Formosa Restaurant, and the original building is right there. And so this filled, I don't know the history of this site at all, but some of you might. But really the restaurant filled in around that, almost like wax, like a candle wax coming out to the property lines. And actually, I think the result is kind of nice, right? So walking by Formosa, you know, it's very sidewalk friendly, and almost none of us know that this wood structure is embedded within it. So just a little quick tour now. Who doesn't know this? Who doesn't? Obviously, this is the most iconic building in Amherst, and it's the wow, right? So my first trip to Amherst, I hit the town common, and I was, you know, blown away. The common, town hall, and everybody. If you're an architect, the very first question that every architect asks is, was this designed by anyone? Was it designed by H.H. Richardson? And the answer is no, but it was heavily influenced by H.H. Richardson, who was the master of what became known as Richardson Romanesque. So Richardson was I don't even know this, Boston, right? Yeah, I thought he moved to New York at some point, Brookline. But I used to work in the shadow of this building. So anyone know this? Northeastern Mass, or Easton Mass. So this is a town hall in Easton Mass. So take, you know, which one's Amherst, which one's Easton? This is actually H.H. Richardson. So that style became very, very popular for sort of mid-sized civic buildings. And you can see the Richardsonian buildings all over, you know, not just in New England, but throughout the country. In fact, there's a book called Richardsonian Buildings of Iowa, or something like that. And none of them are by H.H. Richardson, but they all look like they are. So, moving just time to, oh, and by the way, Richardson did a number of buildings in Easton, including the library, which is right next door.
The library's fabulous.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Bonnie and I visited.
Yeah, worth a trip, by the way.
It is.
And then,
Grace Church.
Grace Episcopal Church. So I knew that a lot of you would know a lot more about this than I do. The architect for this was one of the founders of the American Institute of Architects. I didn't know that until I was putting together the walking tours, actually. And one thing that I find fun to do is find the other buildings that they were doing. So Dudley, who was the architect, was basically the in-house architect for the Episcopal Church at the time. So the is it called the diocese?
Huh.
They had their own architectural staff. And so if you look at his body of work, is this Amherst or is this is in upstate New York?
Huh.
Yeah. So Dudley, founder of the American Institute of Architects. So this is one of my favorite buildings in Amherst. It's the Inn at Baldwin. And there's just so many things I love about this. So one of the things I love is that everyone thinks that it was built incrementally, like the big house, little house, back house, barn. It was all built at the same time. And the architect for this, Putnam and Cox, were very much in the middle of this revival movement, looking to the past for inspiration for the future. And the fact that nothing lines up, like if you go inside of it, and there was a big renovation 2009 or so, and I don't think they fixed much of that. They put a ballroom and some other things. But you have to go up like 3 stairs, and then, so it really has that feel of a house that's been extended and extended. And I think it has a really terrific street edge. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 stories, right up to the street. Now there's probably a 5-foot buffer. And it has a really good rhythm to it, I think. I'm gonna show more Putnam and Cox buildings, including this one, which is, help me out.
Sealy. That's Sealy House.
Sealy House, Sealy
Yeah.
House, also by Putnam and Cox. So after the Inn at Bullwood, that then begins on the Common, a number of old fraternities that were built on the Common, all converted to dorms when Amherst College got rid of fraternities. All built in Georgian Revival, and all built, designed, I think they're all designed by the same firm that did Inn at Bullwood and Jones Library. But they're all different enough and similar enough, think of those soldiers, that there's a consistency to it. You know that they're collegiate buildings, you know sort of what their purpose is, living, learning, whatever, beer pong. But they're all distinct also. So another, well, all the buildings I'm showing you I like. I'm not showing you any buildings I don't like. So anyway, I think that this is a really good case study in big house, back house. So the Baptist Church is the front building. It's a Greek Revival church. A lot of people in Amherst know it as the Fiber Arts Center, because the Fiber Arts Center was there for like 2 years. And depending on when you moved here, take a left at the Fiber Arts Center, and yeah, but if you're new to Amherst, you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But it was taken over by Amherst, bought by Amherst College 12 years ago, you know, something like that, and turned into a number of different uses, including languages. So to better serve their needs, they built this addition behind. And I think this is a really good example of a marriage of modern architecture and historic architecture. So there's a clear break right there. So we can tell that that's the old, that's the new. There's a respectfulness to the rhythm. But it's very clearly a modern building, flat roof, old materials used in a modern way. So yeah, that's the front. Also sometimes known as the Peter Pan. And then I'm sorry, I'm a little bit over here, but that's the Formosa Chinese restaurant I told you about. Then right next to the Baptist Church this is the Merchant Block, right? Merchant. That's where Hastings used to be, right? Where the collective copy is. And it's now a 1, 2, 3, 4-story building. It used to be a 3-story building. There's always a fire involved. There was a fire involved, and the 3-story part is here. The new fourth story was built there, built right to the street edge, but a big wide sidewalk. So if you think of your aspect ratios, you know it works in that condition.
What year was that?
You know what? I'm gonna have to check my notes, but everything probably around 1880, but I'm not positive about that. Let me. It was somewhere around there.
So a lot of buildings in that area?
Yeah,
1880.
1880 was a big building boom. 1870 to 1890, something like that.
Can I ask a question also, if you can go back?
Yep.
Because I noticed maybe even one more. When the church was under renovation to the left, I
Yep.
swore there were a larger set of doors in the back,
Yeah.
meaning that not facing the street.
Yeah.
Like the main entrance was in the back.
Huh.
Is that something that you'd seen, or?
No.
Well, you can't see it in this photo. It's the church to the left.
And by the way, I'm mistaken. The Hastings is the next.
Before the
yeah,
addition.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
It was funny.
And that's a benefit of a background building that you, yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sorry, yeah, that's where Laughing Dog's storefront is and Veracruzana, and then, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Something to look at. So Amherst Cinema, so many of you know the history of this, probably one of the most successful new projects in Amherst. It's been a movie theater for decades. It was Lawler's theater, and actually I know this because I worked for a guy named Jim Lawler, whose family owned it, and he tells me that every time I see him. But then it was subdivided, and some of you know the history much more than I do, made into a small commercial area. Kuhn Riddle, the architects for the project, their office is on the 2nd floor. The cinema's now in the back. But it's also important to know this is a livery before. So we're on the edge of town, so we don't put liveries in the middle of town, we put them on the edges, like parking garages. So this was considered the edge of the town. Also, the Amherst Academy, of course, is right on this site.
And where was that Amherst Hotel? Is that?
Yeah, I have some slides of that, so. Yep. So right across the street from that is the good old Jones Library. Putnam and Cox, same architects, almost the same time as the Inn at Bullwood, also revival. So Inn at Bullwood is farmhouse revival. The Jones Library, Dutch colonial revival. I don't know, whatever. It has a Gambell roof, I associate that with Dutch architecture. In the news a lot, of course, because of the expansion and renovation. Also a really good example of big house, little house, back house, barn, particularly with the addition. So the original library was this, and I have a detail of that. In 1982, there was an addition there, and there are a lot of failures with the addition, but there are also a lot of good things with the addition. Namely, this respectfulness of the big house, little house, back house, barn. I don't have any slides of the left-hand side of this, but there's wood clapboards, so it's going from a stone to a brick to wood, which is a very northern way of building. You put the expensive materials out front, and the cheaper materials around the side, and then the cheapest materials in the back. And this is a detail actually of the original library, so that concept of using cheaper materials and then more expensive materials. So this is not Amherst, but anyone know where this is? Anyone know why I'm showing this? Good. Do I know why I'm showing this? The answer is yes. This is Nantasket Beach, Cohasset Hingham area. It's the dressing house, and it's by the same architects that did the library and did the Inn at Bullwood around the same time. And I'm showing this just to show you how versatile they were. So this is more Art Deco-y, very modern. And so they're able, that shows quite a bit of, in my humble opinion, kind of flexibility, ability to, expand the brand. So.
Oh, God.
That's where it was.
We have a lot of differences in Amherst, but we have one thing in common. We all love to hate this building. But I'm going to read you something from the time that this building was built.
Who gives the license?
Yeah, right. It quite intentionally does not harmonize with its older neighbors. Instead, it dominates its corner, both in its scale and monumentality. Its design, particularly, means traditional for a bank, utilizes modern materials, particularly large areas of glass. It has an open and inviting appearance. So it has all of that, right? And that was written right after the building was done. It was the aspiration of its time. It didn't, what do you call it? Meet the test of time. So it has now become an eyesore. It's the most prominent, other than Town Hall, it's the most prominent corner in Amherst. But if you really squint and you go back to then, and you think, okay, they were trying, at least it's architecture. And it was designed by an architect who actually was with a design build firm, so that all they did were banks. So they went around the country designing and building their banks.
And right across the street, was that a bank? That was a bank too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It was like 60s, 1960s?
This is 1960s, yeah.
Shaman.
Yeah. So this is what was there.
Yeah.
This is a tough corner to build because there was a fire, then a fire, then a fire, and then and I'm going to show you another one towards the end of it. But that's a four-story wood building. Right at that corner, there's the Amherst Academy, I believe, right behind it.
Is that the academy
Yeah,
building
yeah,
beyond
yeah.
it?
You can see it, but next to it is where Amherst Cinema is.
Yeah, that's right. The livery is right. Yeah,
It
who
was
said
a
that?
little
Right
bit
there.
like the Boltwood Inn.
Yeah. And it's really too bad that didn't survive, at least in its form, but anyway, this is by the same architect.
Wow.
It's a Zippy Bank in Jamaica, New York, which is in Queens.
Wow.
And I love this building actually. So they were able to do these beautiful buildings. And so if you go back to this, the idea of the Muscle Beach or the fabric versus the monumental buildings, they're really good at monumental buildings. And the problem is we got a monumental building probably in a place where we needed more of a fabric building. And then the, yeah, this, I'm showing you this for a reason. The architect working outside of this bank company is actually famous for this. This is the Howard Johnson's Gatehouse, and they were built all over. So he designed the prototype for that. And I don't think the Howard Johnson's on Route 9 has one of these, but if you're, they're all over. And actually, this too is a beautiful building. If you squint and if you think about the time. So let's see. Oh, I'm showing now the Phoenix block, which is right across the street from Town Hall. You know, again, a fabric building.
And what would do you care what would have been upstairs?
Do I personally care?
Do you care, or did, you know?
Yeah, so there's something called the Sanborn Insurance Maps. And you can get I think the hard copies you can get at Jones Library or at the UMass Library. You can also get them online. I highly, highly recommend you look at these. They would be in special collections because the paper copies, these were put up by the Sanborn Fire Insurance, sort of like for every city and town in the United States. And they were a way of determining what your fire insurance rates would be. But what they are is early GIS, Geographic Information System. And they'll talk about who lives here, who owns it, what's it made of. And so I looked at the Sanborn maps for this area, ground floor commercial, upstairs student rentals. So these were student rentals, not for UMass, because UMass probably wasn't big enough to, but probably for Amherst College. So whenever I read stories about students living in town, et cetera, it's like we have at least 100 years of history. And if not, let's put on our white gloves and go look at the Sanborn maps because I'll show you. So that is oftentimes like apartments, boarding houses. There still are apartments on the common, but most of them have been converted to commercial areas. Unitarian Church, which also was renovated fairly recently. So this is Arts and Crafts Revival, I think, or was it Arts and Crafts straight up? I love these raking views, kind of these higher up views of Amherst, because you really get a good idea of the fabric of the city. And you notice that I have a particular obsession with Formosa, because but here you can see that back building. You can see the fabric buildings. You can see one Boltwood. You can see old houses that have been converted into commercial. And I also think that Amherst does a really good job in these little parks. Like Sweetser Park is right here. Is that the tip of Sweetser? Yeah, that's the tip of Sweetser Park right there. So we have Sweetser Park, the town common, Kendrick Park, and they kind of anchor different parts of town. They have different purposes. And then now we're going down East Pleasant. We're taking another look at one Boltwood. So a lot of us architects squint at one Boltwood, and we want to click on it. We want to move it right up to the street. Not exactly like that, because in a way it doesn't make that much sense to have this sort of 1 to 2 story wood frame, often underused spaces right on the busiest part of downtown, and then have a much taller building in the back. So a continuation of the buildings right next to it would have made sense. A view from one of the apartments. I don't know if you've ever been in there, but the views from there, you look like, it feels like you're in Siena, or choose your European city. So I'm going to now take us down to the very end of where Triangle and East Pleasant meet, and we're going to work our way backwards. So one Boltwood was the first of these 5-story buildings to be built. Kendrick Place was the second of these to be built in the downtown area. So this was a, you know, we live blank, 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 just behind here. So, you know, near the high school. And I walked through this lot my first 5 years living in Amherst. And when I heard that these guys were proposing to develop a 5-story building there, it's like, there's no chance. This is like weeds and trash. And then I was on the planning board and we saw the plans and it's like, oh my God, they, you know, this is what they're doing. So it's a mixed-use building, meaning that there's a use at the ground floor that's not residential, and then residential above. It is built right out to the property line, which is typical of downtown Amherst, right? You get the right to build out to the property line. Garcia's, formerly Bertucci's, is right there. So is this a very successful building or not? That's arguable. I think that one of the concerns with this is that sidewalk where the building meets Triangle is very narrow. And in a way, that's not the fault of the developers. The developers have the right to develop their property. Maybe the town's right of way should have been bigger or whatever. Anyway, the town is looking at that through a creation of design standards.
It reminds me of the Flatiron Building.
Yeah, exactly. I call it the pizza building, yeah.
Oh.
Go down to the pizza building, take a left.
Oh,
No,
wow.
yeah. Or the, no, it's Flatiron Building's another, okay. This is the most recent one completed. This is completed just last year. Most of the ones in the downtown area were done by the same firm, which is a Portland, Oregon firm. Archipelago, they hired an Arkansas firm for this particular project. So, I mean, I think that architecturally it's pretty rigorous. There's not much of a context to work with. So like if they're building an infill building in downtown, such as the one that's going under construction right now, you can look to the left, look to the right, see what the patterns are and so forth. There's not much of a pattern, so in a way they're trying to establish a new pattern. You could also look at these buildings as being a bridge between the historic core of downtown and UMass, which is a flat-out, unabashed, modern campus. And then 11 East Pleasant as you go up the street. So they're trying to make it contextual. So the brick is from, that's from downtown Amherst, and wood, so brick and wood. There is a decent pedestrian experience there. There's a pinch right there that bothers a lot of people. And again, is it the building that's too big or is it the right of way that's too small? It is, I think that could be corrected someday. And then an aerial view looking back. So we don't like the word urban, we don't like the word density. Like the architects learned that that's actually taught in architecture school, that if you say the word urban, if you say the word density, you're gonna lose whatever public hearing you're in. So we learn how to code that language. But urban to me is a good thing. Urban to me means civic life. It means memorable places. And there's an irony that the same people that don't want Amherst to become a city then go to Northampton, for dinner. But I think that that's something that Amherst is trying to confront and will have to continue to confront. And I think now we have 3 buildings in a row that are, trying to establish a new datum for Amherst, trying to basically become background buildings. So when 11 East Pleasant was first built, everyone called it a skyscraper. It's not a skyscraper, 5 stories. That's a walk-up. So now we have another 5-story building. We have another 5-story building here, and then a lot of 1-story buildings in between. And I think that, Amherst there's a huge need for, I'm not here to pitch a particular point of view, I'm here to talk about the architecture, but there is a huge demand for housing, and in a way what they're doing is they are addressing that huge demand for housing. The other thing, going back to my concept slides, is they are creating a street edge. They're also creating an edge to Kendrick Park. Like Central Park has enormous buildings, the Dakota, on it. So there's definitely a place for for tall buildings.
And may I ask, is that a plaza within the red brick building?
This is a parking area, actually,
Oh.
yeah, I know, exactly. So this one has a little plaza right there in the front, but no, that's a private area.
Okay.
So actually, I'm right on time, so I'm gonna end here at 40, I was trying to get to 45 minutes. One more slide, and then we can open up for questions and comments. So let's take us back to the center of town. So this is one of I had this as my screensaver. All the years I was on town council, this is my screensaver because it's a reminder of where Amherst has come.
Wow.
So I think that this was taken maybe off a ladder truck in front of the firehouse. So I spent a lot of time trying to do forensics to figure it out. So it's way before drones. It's from the 1950s. Way before drones, not high enough for a helicopter. My best guess is like a bucket truck from the fire station. And if you stare at it, there's a police officer right there, and I think he might be headed there to direct traffic, which is actually a better idea than the stoplights we have. We see the site of the old Amherst Hotel right there, which was a grocery store, I believe. But the thing that I find amazing is that clearly Amherst was a commercial center. It's springtime. Every parking space is filled, so these people are here for something. There's no farmer's market. We hadn't thought of farmer's markets in the 1950s. So they're here to go shopping, probably, or to visit, but it's, basically, to me, that was an aspirational photo. But the other thing that is noticeable is how little Amherst has changed. In 1950, that's 70 years. It's just, most of it is recognizable. In fact, the only one that's not recognizable is, this block right here. And then one more comment about the North Common is that that's Spring Street right there. So Spring Street was cut through by then. But you can see that the North Common was used for parking, but less invasive parking. And then over the years, we crept with parking till we paved over the entire North Common. And then that has all been changed in the last, recently, just opened. So no more parking on the North Common. That's it, that's what I got to say. Yeah, let's do questions.
Question about I was only 10 years old, the Woolworth building. I noticed that it has an angled front to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one right there.
Was that in the mold?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see that. I was wondering if that's what
Yeah.
the basis idea of the lousy savings bank.
I think there's a reason for that. I think that it's what's called a clear sight triangle.
Yeah.
So what it means is that the people turning right, that they have a view, so they can see if they're, what's ahead. And my guess is that's what it is. And then of course the Bank of America building is all clear sight triangle. It's all 45 degrees. Yeah.
When we moved here in 1982, there was a drugstore on the corner.
Yeah.
A grocery store here, Louis.
Yeah.
Matthew's shoe store.
Yeah.
A hardware store just down the hill.
Okay.
A bunch of clothing stores, and now it's mostly all restaurants.
Yeah.
And so the uses downtown have certainly changed with the food. malls,
Yeah.
malls.
My wife lived here in 1982, and she has a bag for yarn that's in her attic, and it's a shoe store that the address is downtown somewhere, so I have always been meant to trace, and that's probably the shoe store that you're.
Matthew's,
Yeah, and, so, those times have, I don't know, I think that there are a lot of communities that have reinvented themselves, understand that we're gonna still get a lot of our stuff on Prime, Amazon Prime, but there's a lot of stuff. Getting our shoes repaired, experiences, things like that we can't get online, but there are, in New England, a lot of communities that still have very thriving central business districts. So, yeah, so long histories here.
Well, I think that the town is a seasonal town. And
Yeah.
that greatly impacts and makes the difference between here. We are more like Chatham than we are
Yeah.
like Northampton. And-
First.
But we have never, and the university, it seems, has never really made an effort to look at all the towns that have seasonal towns and the implications of that and how we fit in that spectrum.
Yeah, so I grew up in a beach town, and we loved September through May. Actually, yeah, because we got all the restaurants, we got all of the retail that was provided for the 3 months tourists. And of course now Amherst is a 9-month town. I mean, I think there was a couple of things that could happen. So year-round universities, so UMass does talk about wanting to become a year-round university. I worked in Florida before I moved to Amherst at a public university, and Florida has a requirement that all students at public universities must go one summer session. So there's no, well, Gainesville, I guess, would be the closest to a college town. But Amherst is kind of unique. We're not Burlington, Vermont. You know, the other college towns, we're not, I guess we are Storrs, Connecticut to a certain degree. We're, you know, it's such a major 9-month town, but I think that's a really good point.
Well, it used to be a 9-month town, but the university now, who knows what the rhythm is. It's,
Right.
they
Now
seem
it's
to
like
come and
6
go
months.
much more frequently
Yeah,
than
yeah.
they used to.
No, January.
The tides have
Yeah,
changed.
Yeah, yeah.
We were at a wedding in New Brunswick where Rutgers is, and they have this intermix like Amherst has over, you know, a decade, but they're allowing the buildings to go up like 10 stories.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Amherst's limit and what's your opinion should be the limit of no taller buildings?
I think
What
5
level?
stories is a good height, actually. So 5 stories is a good height for all kinds of weird reasons that we sort of maxed out. We sort of established a datum downtown with basically around 55 feet, like some of these buildings downtown. And now you can build 5-story buildings that are around 55 feet, just using, you know, clever uses of the floor plate. It's also walkable, so like you can walk up 5 stories logically. Not that that's a reason. Easy to build. 10 stories, you start, like Springfield has a lot of, you know, towers, residential towers downtown. And what happens is it creates a weird rhythm also, and it, I think 5 stories is a good one, actually. I'll leave it at that.
That's more lighted, a little more light
Yeah,
than a tall.
just, you can understand a 5-story building more than you can understand a 6-story building, or, you know, just, 6-story building pretty much guarantees you're taking the elevator. Yeah, taking the elevator, yeah.
One of the things I don't like about the new 5-story buildings is, well, one thing, it's hard to walk with a stroller or something
Yeah.
because of that point,
Yeah,
which always annoys me, and then they have a drain coming out
Yeah.
from the point.
Yeah.
And often they put their signs advertising they don't have, they're looking for
Yeah,
more
right on
people
that
to live
point.
there. right
Yeah.
there. But it's a big space on the bottom, and I like the little stores that go in the buildings that have little spaces, so
Yeah.
little entrepreneurs can then rent, like the new Astor and Pine, the new little stores.
Yeah.
But they're not gonna rent that the giant spaces for rent.
no, the
Would that
new
be
buildings
fine?
were all, big idea buildings, you know, they really need big tenants. They, and we, you know, when I was on the planning board, we discussed this a lot, like, can we regulate that you must have 1,000-square-foot stores, you must rent to mom and pops? There are parts of Boston, so Boston basically, it's not called the BRA anymore, but it's basically has control over every parcel in major parts of Boston that has to go be reviewed by them. And they actually do have, you know, easements that you must rent to artists, you must have this, and right now, we don't have that leverage in Amherst. That would be overstepping, so we would need some sort of an overlay, like a small business overlay or something like that. But when we go on the walking tour in October, I think it is, we'll go by Laughing Dog. Like Laughing Dog, you know, they have a little storefront in the building that I showed, and then the actual store is you know, 3 stories, and those guys are taking bikes up and down, and they'd be so much better as a storefront, right? Or, so we pack in these really desirable retail into these back spaces, and then the front spaces are, I don't know, something's backwards.
But could those little stores afford the big space? I mean, Laughing Dog.
Well, that would be the
Yes,
easement
right.
or the agreement, you know,
Yeah,
that,
those are all the
yeah.
interesting stories.
yeah. That would be an act of Congress or the act of the, you know.
Town council.
Town council. Yeah.
Do you have any sense about the percentage occupancy of the new buildings, both commercial space and
Well, the commercial space, we you know, watch a lot. I mean, are they successful or?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
they
that the
fill it out.
restaurants at AYA and the Protocol, those seem to be packed all the time that I go by them.
Right.
And then I think there's a lot of disappointment that the pizza building didn't have like a little cafe or something.
Mm.
But that seemed to be packed. I mean, COVID changed everything.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that as far as I know, the units are at whatever although I agree with you, why are they advertising so much?
And where did they put the sign, right?
So you know, that corner has been talked about more than anything. I've heard 10 years of discussion about that corner, and I'm good with that. And every time I go by there, I squint and I redesign it. And what I do is I leave it. I put a little plaza there, you know, just because I think that the people that were bothered by that at the beginning are right, that it's a pinch point and it could have been solved in design. So
You mentioned Central Park.
yeah.
And one of the things that makes Central Park so beautiful in New York are those wide sidewalks both by the.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's the space that
Yeah.
opens it up in a way.
Yeah.
We don't have that at Kendrick Park, it's a little tighter there.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be better as it goes on, but at the moment
Yeah.
it seems a little tight.
Yeah. Good point.
I like the shade that big buildings provide, you know. And, you know, for health reasons, it's important to be in the shade sometimes.
No, it's so interesting you say that.
But those big
It's
buildings, they generate revenue,
Oh, yeah.
lots of revenue,
Yeah.
so for
Tax
that,
dollars,
they're
yeah.
also important.
They generate revenue, plus they generate demand, so we don't have a grocery store downtown, so, well, other than the one that you just mentioned. the
See,
little-
why I'm jealous of that picture.
I know, and you know, we're not gonna get a grocery store downtown until we have enough, what are called rooftops, people living in downtown. But every new tenant helps, especially every new tenant that walks helps, because one of the big challenges for urban grocery stores is parking. So if you can have a mostly walkable Trader Joe's, then it takes up a lot of different kinds of space. And I saw, yeah.
What about the building on Spring Street, the new one?
Yeah, you know, I was gonna show a slide of that.
Yeah.
So that went through planning board when I was on planning board. It, you know.
It seems to fit in pretty well there.
Yeah, it does. You know, it's hard to be in these public positions like planning board, town council,
Yeah.
and just hear the drumbeat of, you know, mostly critique.
Yeah.
And then see what actually is built. And I actually think the Spring Street building is quite handsome.
Mm.
And they really tried. And
Yeah.
actually, you know, we had, the church itself said that it was going to block the sun coming into their big window. And I just looked at a drone slide of it, you know, with the sun rising in the east and the sun is not blocking. You know, oftentimes the things that people are concerned about never come true. So actually your comment about the shade, you know, there was a lot of comment about we need sunny sidewalks, therefore we can't have tall
We need
buildings.
that too,
And I go,
yeah.
there's always the sunny side.
Yeah.
Walk on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side of life, if you want the sun, yeah.
Do you have any architectural ideas for the Bank of America? What would you do to change that?
It's,
I mean,
I
it's
salivate
not
when I,
like tear it
yeah,
down.
I would make it a five, I would go back to Amherst Hotel, actually, because I think we need more.
Grocery store.
Could you
You know, the grocery store, it was a grocery store, but it'd be hard because there is a demand for loading, and for parking and for
Yeah.
trash. So, yeah,
Could you take the present place and make it nicer, like getting rid of those pillars and new facade?
I think it would be an amazing, design competition. to
Just
do.
take the sign off the top, I was looking at that photo, and
Yeah.
the building
Yeah.
wasn't half bad, it's the logo.
Yeah, yeah,
And if you started by removing that,
yeah,
because
yeah,
it does
we
fit
should,
an
we should
idea.
have a.
Because then you can see what they were trying to do.
Good luck.
Yeah.
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 And I'm sorry, I'm losing track of the hits.
So I had a question about Amherst College. Does it have its own set of design standards? It seems like it has such an impact
Yeah.
on the rest of the town.
So Amherst has its own rules when it's on Amherst property, so it's in what's called the education district, except that all of it's not. So the fraternities are in the town, so they're owned, obviously owned by Amherst, but they're subject to town zoning. And then they have dorms that are on, there's a dorm on Lincoln and Amity Street that is subject, so and also the Amherst College Housing that's over by the football field. So they basically are exempt from zoning if they're building in the education zone. So there is a requirement that they have to present it, do a public presentation, but the planning board doesn't have jurisdiction, so we can comment, and then they can do what they want. They've been good. Amherst, UMass, completely exempt, so it's a state institution, and since they can override anything they do, they also are supposed to go to the town for just a public presentation of new projects, but there's no jurisdiction.
Like the Southwest Towers are so completely, I don't know, it's just completely different than anything else.
Yeah. And I squint and I look at those and I make those 5-story buildings. Architects can't help themselves to squint, like,
If they'd taken those out, it would be a beautiful terraced area, because it's
Absolutely.
terraced.
so
From
like,
Sunset to the middle, down to
Yeah.
University
Terrace.
Drive, it's a terrace.
Paris, Washington DC are height limited communities, and because of that height limit, they're able to create beautiful streets. So like, if you think of Washington as downtown Washington being
I agree.
50-story towers,
Yeah.
then you would no longer have that, that beautiful fabric.
I wondered if you could comment on the new North Common and how it relates civically to Town Hall and us.
Yeah. So I was first on the planning board, then the town council. That was an important project. I was one of the voices that said that you should take parking off of our most common. It's the most common space that the most egalitarian space we have, and you're privileging people with cars if you park on that. So, and there's ways to replace the parking. So there was no on-street parking around the common at the time, or very little on-street parking. So we did a calculation of take the parking off, so you no longer have an entrance and an exit to parking, and then you can put a lot of that parking back on the street. And the calculation was pretty close. And so I think it's one of the best decisions that we've made in my time elected. I was not involved at all in the actual design, other than that decision to not have it be a parking lot. And let's wait for it to fill out. Come back in 5 years and we can talk about it.
I like the way they did a sidewalk all the way around.
Yeah, no, it's a nice
the
sidewalk,
common.
nice narrow sidewalk, places for people to gather and protest and, whatever.
And
Yeah.
are they doing that on Kendrick also, like extending the sidewalk?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yeah.
Maybe some older residents of Amherst, where the CVS is, used to be a grocery store,
Yeah.
Louis Foods. Some of us worked there.
Oh.
You know who else worked there? Natalie Cole. But anyway. But does anybody remember when Louis Foods moved out of there?
Yeah.
What year was that?
Early
In
90s.
the seventies.
They used to have Easter egg hunts there, and
Yeah.
the kids would come in and
Yeah.
try to find them.
I think it was late 80s, early
Yeah.
90s.
I mean, cause like, I
So-
come from a very large family, and my
Yeah.
mom used to do the 2-week grocery shopping there, and, we always used to beg her to park in the shady spots in the back.
You're breaking my heart.
It's really interesting, this last little go-round, how looking at old photographs from 50, 70 years ago, trigger a conversation about the history that resides in all of your minds. And I really like that I mean, that's one aspect of architecture I never really have thought about, how it
Yeah.
just triggers what was here first, what's coming next, and it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
That was great.